In the last days of April 1555, the bells of London started ringing for the birth of a prince. Bonfires went up, tables came out into the streets, ships on the Thames fired salutes, and the news travelled so fast that celebrations were underway in Antwerp before anyone thought to check it. The child being toasted did not exist. Inside the birthing chamber at Hampton Court, Queen Mary of England sat on cushions on the floor, knees drawn up to her chin, a magnificently carved cradle standing ready beside her, letters announcing the safe delivery already written out with the date left blank. She was 39. She had wanted a child with everything in her. Her body had swollen and quickened, and by some reports produced milk, and week by week that spring it was becoming clear to the women around her, before it became clear to her, that the pregnancy was made of grief and hope, and nothing else. History filed this woman under Bloody Mary, a name that ended up on a cocktail and a sleepover mirror game, and the nickname is earned. Close to 300 people burned alive in 4 years on her signature. Tonight she leads a lineup of 5, alongside Isabella of France, the Empress Wu ZeTian, Catherine de Medici, and Irina of Athens, and we'll take them one at a time. Before the bells fade out, a quick hello. Welcome in. Whether this is your first time here or you've been around since the early videos. Thank you sincerely to the supporters. These long episodes exist because of you and for no other reason. And while you're getting comfortable, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Day shift, night shift, whatever time zone this finds you in, reading those is genuinely the best part of posting these. All right, back to Mary and back to the very beginning, long before the bells. Mary was born in February 1516 at Greenwich, the only living child from 6 pregnancies her mother Catherine of Aragon carried. A run of stillbirths and infant deaths that included a prince who lived 7 weeks and broke both parents when he went. Henry VIII, still young then, still charming, doted on the daughter he got to keep. He carried her around court, showing her off to ambassadors, boasting that this child never cried. She was betrothed to the French Dauphin when she was 2, a diamond ring pushed onto a toddler's finger, and betrothed again at 6 to her cousin, the Emperor Charles V, a grown man twice her age who visited England and met his tiny fiancée and gave her an emerald. None of these matches were ever going to happen as designed. Princesses were currency and the exchange rate moved daily. But the point is what her childhood looked like. Tutors hand-picked by her formidable mother, Latin, music, a girl so gifted at the virginals that visitors were sat down to listen. At 9, she was sent to Ludlow with a princely household to preside over the Welsh marches, the traditional posting of a Prince of Wales, without the title but with everything else. For a while, Henry treated her as his heir in all but name. Then her father decided her mother had never really been his wife, and the whole structure came down on the child inside it. The annulment fight ran for years, Henry arguing that his marriage to his brother's widow was cursed by scripture, Catherine standing in open court to swear on her soul that she had come to Henry a maid, and Mary, a teenager, through the worst of it, watching her parents' marriage litigated in front of Christendom. In 1531, Henry separated mother and daughter. Catherine of Aragon lived 5 more years, and Mary was never allowed to see her again. Not once. Letters were smuggled. and in them Catherine told her daughter to obey the king her father in everything short of offending God, advice that reads very differently once you know what obedience was about to cost. In 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn. The new marriage was declared valid, the old one void, and Mary, at 17, was reclassified overnight from Princess of Wales to the Lady Mary, the king's illegitimate daughter. Her household of hundreds was dissolved. She was sent to Hatfield to serve in the establishment of the new baby, Elizabeth, as a kind of attendant to the half-sister who had replaced her under the supervision of Anne Boleyn's aunt, Lady Shelton. Reports from that household, carried to the imperial ambassador Chapuys, say that Anne instructed Shelton to slap Mary's ears if she dared use the title of princess, and to call her the cursed bastard. When the household moved between residences, Mary was expected to ride behind the baby's litter, and on at least one occasion she had to be more or less forced into the procession. She started refusing food she feared might be tampered with. Chapuys, who adored her, and whose dispatches are our main window into these years, was genuinely afraid she would be poisoned or quietly done away with, and whether or not the danger was ever that concrete, Mary believed it was, and lived with that belief for years. Her health broke in this period and never fully mended. Chronic pain, catastrophic menstrual trouble that physicians of the time wrote about with unusual frankness, headaches, depressions, illnesses that flared every autumn like a calendar of grief. Catherine of Aragon died in January 1536 at Kimbolton, still calling herself queen, and when they opened her body for embalming, the man doing it found the heart black through, with a dark growth attached to it, a detail that fed poison rumours at the time and reads to modern eyes like cancer. Mary was forbidden to attend the funeral. Anne Boleyn went to the block that May, and Mary seems to have genuinely expected that with Anne gone, her father would take her back on the old terms. Instead, Henry sent commissioners with a document. To be received back into her father's favour, Mary had to sign her name to statements acknowledging the king as supreme head of the Church of England, repudiating the Pope, and, the sentence that mattered most, admitting that her parents' marriage had been incestuous and unlawful, that she herself was base-born. They ground her down for weeks. Her friends told her that refusal might mean the Tower, might mean the fate of the monks who had refused the oath and been butchered at Tyburn. In the end, in June 1536, she signed. The story that came down through her circle is that she signed without letting herself read the words. Then she secretly wrote to the Pope's representatives asking for absolution for what she had just done. She was 20 years old, and I'd argue that signature is the hinge of her whole life. Everything people call fanaticism in the later Mary looks, from here, like a woman who betrayed her mother and her God under pressure once, and organized the rest of her existence around never doing it again. The next 17 years were a long, grey corridor. Restored to favour but not legitimacy, godmother to her little brother Edward, welcome at court under the later stepmothers, unmarried while every negotiation for her hand dissolved, because what prince buys a bride whose own father calls her a bastard? Henry died in 1547, the 9-year-old Edward became king, and the men around Edward drove the Reformation far past anything Henry had wanted, and Mary's Mass, the centre of her surviving world, became illegal. She refused to give it up. She heard Mass in her household daily, sometimes multiple times, in open defiance, and when summoned to court, she rode into London with dozens of retainers wearing forbidden rosaries at their belts, a procession designed to be seen. Her cousin the Emperor threatened war on her behalf. In the summer of 1550, things got desperate enough that an actual escape was mounted. Imperial warships hovering off the Essex coast to carry her to Flanders, a smuggler ready at Malden, and at the last hours Mary froze, packed and unpacked, agonized on the shore of her own life, and stayed. She reportedly kept saying she wanted to go and could not make herself abandon England and her place in the succession. It's one of those nights where you can watch a person's future being decided in real time. Edward was dying by 1553, tuberculosis eating him at 15, coughing up matter his attendants described in terms "I'll spare you before breakfast," and the men running his government, led by the Duke of Northumberland, rewrote the succession on the boy's authority to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin married conveniently to Northumberland's own son. Mary was invited to London to visit her dying brother, a trap by every reasonable reading, and she was warned in time, turned her horse, and rode hard into East Anglia through the night. What followed is easy to skip past and shouldn't be. A 37-year-old spinster, legally bastardized with no army, raised her standard at Framlingham Castle, and England came to her. Gentry, commons, the crews of the warships sent to blockade her, who mutinied and marched their guns to her camp. Within 9 days, the regime in London collapsed without a battle. Northumberland was throwing his cap in the air for Queen Mary in the market square at Cambridge, in the hope it would save him. And it didn't. She entered London to a roar of bells and gun salutes, with Elizabeth riding beside her, her father's throne, taken back by the daughter he had disinherited, in the only fully successful armed rising against the Tudor state in its entire history. And she began gently. This is the part the nickname buries. Northumberland was executed, of course, but Jane Grey, the 16-year-old who had been used as the figurehead, Mary spared, kept her in the Tower in decent conditions, and told the imperial ambassador she could not bring herself to kill her. She released the old Catholic prisoners of the previous reigns, dithered over what to do with Elizabeth, and issued a proclamation saying she would not compel her subjects' consciences for the time being. The two decisions that ended all of that arrived together, a Spanish husband and an English rebellion. Mary chose to marry Philip of Spain, the Emperor's son, 11 years her junior, a match her council and her commons begged her to reconsider, because England marrying into Habsburg Spain looked to a lot of Englishmen like England becoming a Habsburg province. In January 1554, a rising broke out under Sir Thomas Wyatt, and it got terrifyingly far, thousands of Kentish men reaching the gates of London itself, fighting at Charing Cross close enough that arrows came over the palace walls, and Mary's ladies were screaming and the men around her told her to flee downriver. She refused, went to the Guildhall, and gave the speech of her life to the city, and London held. The rising failed at the gates. The mercy died with it. Jane Grey and her young husband were beheaded that February, and the details of Jane's end have never let go of anyone who reads them. She watched from her window as her husband's headless body came back from Tower Hill in a cart, the head wrapped in a cloth beside it. On the scaffold she made her short speech, tied the blindfold over her own eyes, and then couldn't find the block, groping in the dark in front of the crowd, asking, "What shall I do? Where is it?" until someone climbed up and guided her hands to it. She was 16, maybe 17. Around 100 of Wyatt's rebels were hanged in batches, gibbets set up at the gates of London and in the villages the rebels came from. The bodies left through the spring as instruction. Elizabeth, suspected of complicity that was never proven, was rowed to the Tower through Traitor's Gate in the rain, begging to be allowed to write to her sister, sitting down on the wet stones and refusing to go in for a while, because people who went through that gate tended not to come out. Philip arrived in the summer of 1554 and married Mary at Winchester. He was 27, she was 38, and his entourage wrote home snide letters about her age and her clothes, while Philip himself performed his duties, all of them with the correctness of a man executing a treaty. Mary fell wholly in love with him. Everyone around her could see it, and most of them could see it wasn't coming back in kind. By that autumn, her physicians confirmed what she believed with all her heart. She was pregnant, and the news went out across Europe. Her belly swelled. She reported the child moving, milk, according to some of her women. In April 1555, she went into confinement at Hampton Court, with the nursery prepared, the carved cradle and the pre-dated letters waiting. Everything you heard at the top of this video. At the end of April, a rumor got loose that the prince was born, and the city exploded into the scene this whole video opened with. The bells, the bonfires, the tables in the streets, all of it for a child who was never there. Then weeks passed. The due date came, was recalculated, came again. Inside the birthing chamber, the Venetian ambassador reported, "The Queen sat for hours the way we found her at the start of this video, down on the cushions, knees drawn up, and anyone who has been near that hope and that failure will recognize the posture of a woman holding herself together." By August, it was simply over. Her body unswelled. Whether it had been a phantom pregnancy conjured by desperate hope or an ovarian tumor mimicking one, and modern medical readers lean towards some mix. The humiliation was continental. Every court in Europe had been watching her belly, and every court in Europe was told, in effect, that the Queen of England had been carrying nothing. Philip left for Flanders within weeks. She wrote to him constantly. He answered with the diplomatic minimum. The fires had already started by then, and this is the rain inside the rain. At the end of 1554, Parliament restored the old heresy laws, the ones that sentenced unrepentant heretics to burn, and in February 1555, a preacher named John Rogers, who had helped produce the English Bible, went to the stake at Smithfield as the first. His wife and 11 children, the youngest still at the breast, stood along his route to the fire, and witnesses said he looked as if he were walking to his wedding, and that when the flames took hold, he washed his hands in them. It helps to know what this punishment actually involved. since the word burning has gone soft with use. If the wood was dry and the wind kind, the smoke might take you in minutes. If the wood was green or the fire small, you cooked from the feet upward while conscious. Bishop John Hooper at Gloucester that same February got green faggots and a wind that kept blowing the flame away from his body, and the fire had to be lit 3 times. Witnesses timed him at 3/4 of an hour. His legs were consumed while he was still praying aloud, and near the end he was beating his chest with a hand that had burned into a stump until the arm itself came away, and he knocked on with the other until it stuck fast to the charred flesh of his chest. That October at Oxford, the old bishops Latimer and Ridley went to a shared stake. Latimer, near 80, called across the fire the line every English schoolchild once knew, telling Ridley to play the man, that they'd light such a candle in England as should never be put out, and then Latimer died fast, mercifully fast. Ridley didn't. His fire was built wrong, packed too tight with gorse around his legs, and it burned his lower body away while his upper body stayed untouched and fully conscious, and he was heard screaming for someone to let the fire come to him, while his brother-in-law, trying to help, piled on more fuel and made it worse, until at last the flame reached the bag of gunpowder tied at his neck. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had annulled Mary's mother's marriage and written the Protestant prayer books, they worked on differently, and what they did to him was in some ways crueler than the stake. Months of imprisonment, disputation, pressure, and it worked. Cranmer recanted. He signed submission after submission, 6 documents in all, each more grovelling, fully accepting the Pope, condemning his life's work. By every rule of the game, a recanted heretic did public penance and lived. Mary wanted him burned anyway, for what he had done to her mother as much as to the church, and the sentence stood despite the recantations, and that decision handed him back his soul. On the day of execution in March 1556, put up in the University Church to read his final recantation aloud, Cranmer went off script in front of everyone, renounced the recantations as things written by his hand against the truth in his heart out of fear of death, and declared that the hand that had signed them would burn first. At the stake, he held his right hand steadily out into the flame until it was consumed, before the fire reached the rest of him. Bishops and archbishops make the famous stories, and they were the minority. Around 280 people burned in under 4 years, and the lists which survive in court records as well as in John Fox's martyrology are weavers, sawyers, brewers, apprentices, farm labourers, at least 56 of them women, several of them elderly, several of them teenagers. A blind boy named Thomas Drowry burned at Gloucester, and on Guernsey in July 1556, a case that even hardened readers of Fox tend to remember afterward whether they want to or not. 3 women of one family, a mother named Catherine Coches and her 2 daughters, condemned in a proceeding that had started as a petty theft accusation, and one of the daughters, Peratine Massey, was heavily pregnant, a fact the authorities either missed or ignored. In the fire, the trauma brought on labour, and she delivered a living baby boy into the flames. A bystander pulled the infant out alive. The island's bailiff ordered it thrown back, on the reasoning, if that word applies, that the child of a heretic should burn with her. Fox printed the account with names, and Fox was a Protestant propagandist with every motive to blacken the reign. His book has errors and heightening in it. That's fair, and Catholic critics said so at the time. On this case, though, an official inquiry under Elizabeth ended with the men responsible seeking royal pardons for their part in it, and men don't ask pardon for something that never happened. Mary was not squeamish about any of this. That has to be said plainly. She signed off on the policy, prodded slack bishops, and by the standards of her age, she was doing something almost everyone in power across Europe agreed on in principle, that heresy was a plague that damned souls and burning was the cautery. Where she miscalculated, and her own advisers, including Philip's Spanish churchmen, told her so, was in scale and in choice of victims. Burning a famous bishop is one thing. Burning the local blind boy and the weaver's widow in batches in front of their neighbors year after year turned the crowds. Sheriffs started reporting sympathy at the executions. People crying out encouragement to the dying, gathering ashes. The fires meant to sterilize England against Protestantism inoculated it instead, and Fox's book, sitting chained in parish churches for generations afterward, made sure nobody forgot a single name. Her last 2 years were a long run of losses. Philip came back briefly in 1557, long enough to pull England into his war with France, and left again, and she announced a second pregnancy that winter, and this one nobody around her believed, and they were right not to. In January 1558, Calais fell to the French, the last English possession on the continent, held for over 200 years, gone in a week, and Mary is reported to have told her ladies that when she was dead and opened, they would find Calais written on her heart. An influenza epidemic, one of the deadliest of the century, was scything through England, and it caught her that autumn along with whatever was already growing inside her, quite possibly the same disease that had shown on her mother's heart. In her last weeks, she told her women not to grieve, that she had good dreams, that she saw little children like angels playing before her, singing. On the 17th of November 1558, at dawn, she heard Mass in her chamber at St. James's and died during it, at the elevation of the host by some accounts, either a pious embroidery or exactly the death she would have ordered from a catalogue. By nightfall, the bells of London were ringing, and the bonfires were lit, and the tables were out in the streets for Elizabeth. Her will asked that her mother's remains be brought from Peterborough to lie beside her. It wasn't done. She lies in Westminster Abbey under her sister. Literally, Elizabeth's coffin was placed on top of hers decades later, one monument above them both, with a Latin inscription about two sisters, partners in throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. England's first crowned queen regnant, buried as the footnote in her rival's tomb. A different London church once held an even stranger royal burial than Mary's. In November 1358, at the Greyfriars near Newgate, an old woman was lowered into the ground wearing the cloak she had been married in 50 years earlier, and on her chest, at her own request, the friars placed a small silver casket holding the embalmed heart of her husband. The husband she had invaded England to destroy. The husband who died in a locked room at Berkeley Castle while she ruled the kingdom beside her lover. Later centuries would call her the She-Wolf of France, a name she never heard while she lived. And the road to that grave starts in a church in Boulogne in January 1308, with a 12-year-old girl marrying a man she had never met. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, the king they called Philip the Fair, and fair meant handsome, not just. This is the man who destroyed the Knights Templar, who burned their Grand Master on an island in the Seine, who bullied a pope so hard the pope died of the humiliation. Isabella grew up in that household. She was beautiful, everyone agreed on that. Educated well beyond the standard for princesses, and she was raised to understand power as a family business. When she was still a small child, she was promised to the heir of England to seal a peace between the two kingdoms, and in January 1308, the marriage happened. She was 12. Edward II was 23, tall, athletic, physically impressive, freshly crowned, and completely, publicly devoted to a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. How devoted became clear within days. Edward crossed to France for the wedding and left Gaveston behind as regent of England. An outrageous appointment on its own, and when the newlyweds sailed back to Dover, Edward walked off the ship, saw Gaveston waiting on the dock, and threw his arms around him, kissing him repeatedly in front of the entire court, including his new wife. The wedding gifts came next. Philip had sent his daughter to England with jewels, rings, war horses, the sort of trousseau a French princess of the senior royal line travels with. Edward handed a good portion of it to Gaveston. Chroniclers noted Gaveston wearing jewelry from Isabella's wedding settlement at court functions, in front of her. The coronation, a few weeks later, was worse. Gaveston organized it, put himself in royal purple sewn with pearls when the other earls wore cloth of gold, and carried the crown of St. Edward in the procession, the single most honored role in the ceremony, given to a Gascon nobody. The banquet afterward was a shambles. The food arrived late and badly cooked, and the tapestries on the walls displayed the arms of Edward and Gaveston together, side by side, where the arms of Edward and Isabella should have hung. The king spent the feast on Gaveston's couch. Isabella's uncles, princes of France who had crossed the Channel for this, walked out. One report from that spring has them going home and telling Philip that his daughter was the most wretched of wives, that the king preferred the couch of his favourite to hers. She was 12, remember, sitting under the wrong tapestries at her own coronation feast, watching her jewelry on another man's hands. What exactly Edward and Gaveston were to each other has been argued about since the 14th century itself. Contemporaries used the language of brotherhood, of adoptive kinship, of excessive and improper love, and some chroniclers were blunter than that. What matters for Isabella's story is simpler. The man mattered more to her husband than she did, more than the barons did, more than the kingdom's peace did, and everyone could see it. The barons forced Gaveston into exile 3 separate times. Edward brought him back 3 separate times, each return more reckless than the last, until in the summer of 1312, a group of earls simply took the matter out of the legal system entirely. Gaveston was captured, held, and then handed to the Earl of Lancaster's men, who marched him to a hill called Blacklow, ran him through with a sword, and cut his head off. His body lay where it fell until some shoemakers found it and carried it to a group of Dominican friars who couldn't bury him because he died excommunicated, so they embalmed him instead and kept the corpse above ground for over 2 years while the king grieved. Edward never forgave the men who did it. He kept Gaveston's memory like a wound he refused to let close, funding prayers for him for the rest of his reign. Isabella, through all of this, did something that tends to get overlooked because of what came later. She stayed loyal. She was pregnant during the Gaveston crisis, and in November 1312 she gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. And the birth of an heir steadied everything for a while. 3 more children followed over the next decade. She interceded with her husband on behalf of petitioners, ran a large household, went on pilgrimage, played the Queen's role well enough that foreign observers praised her. For roughly 10 years, whatever private humiliations she absorbed them. She was a capette. Capettes did not make scenes. They waited. One episode from those middle years shows you exactly what she was capable of once she decided someone had crossed a line. In 1313, she and Edward visited Paris, and Isabella gave embroidered purses as gifts to her 3 sisters-in-law, the wives of her 3 brothers. The following year, back in France again, she noticed 2 of those purses hanging from the belts of 2 young Norman knights, brothers named Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay. She told her father. Philip the Fair put the knights under watch, and what the watch turned up was that 2 of his daughters-in-law had been meeting the d'Aunay brothers for adulterous liaisons, some of them allegedly in an old tower on the Seine called the Tour de Nesle, with the 3rd princess accused of knowing and covering for them. The scandal detonated the French royal family. The 2 guilty princesses had their heads shaved and were thrown into underground imprisonment, and Margaret, the wife of the heir to the throne, died in the fortress of Château Gaillard within a couple of years, in a cell that accounts describe as open to the weather, with rumours that her death was helped along once her husband needed to remarry. The d'Aunay brothers got the full treatment reserved for men who had committed treason against the king's blood. They were tortured for confessions, and the record of their execution says they were flayed, that their genitals were cut off and thrown to the dogs, that they were broken and finally beheaded, their bodies left hanging by the armpits for the crows. All of it traced back to a Queen of England noticing 2 purses on 2 belts and saying something. Whether she understood what she was setting off, whether she intended anything beyond reporting what she saw, the sources don't say. Some historians have wondered if there was calculation in it, since the scandal conveniently damaged the legitimacy of her brother's children and decades down the line, fed into her own son's claim to the French throne. That's probably asking a 14-year-old chain of consequences to have been planned in advance. What the affair does show plainly is that Isabella observed, remembered, and acted, and that people around her tended to underestimate how dangerous that combination was. Meanwhile, her husband's reign was rotting. Bannockburn in 1314 was a military catastrophe against the Scots so complete that Edward barely escaped the field, and Isabella herself, who had travelled north with the campaign, came close to capture. The years after brought famine, the worst in centuries, rain that drowned the harvests 2 summers running, villages eating seed corn and then eating nothing, and a king who responded to national collapse by digging ditches and thatching roofs with his household servants, hobbies his barons found degrading in a monarch. And into that vacuum stepped the dispensers, a father and son, both named Hugh, and the son is the one who matters here, because Hugh Despenser the younger did what Gaveston had done to Isabella's marriage, except with an appetite Gaveston never had. Gaveston wanted glamour and the king's love. Despenser wanted land, money, and control of the machinery of government, and he got all three. He was married to the king's niece, which gave him a claim to a slice of the vast Clare inheritance in Wales, and he spent the early 1320s expanding that slice by every method available: legal chicanery, armed seizure, imprisonment, and torture. One case that his enemies kept bringing up involved a widow named Lady Barrett, whose lands he wanted, and the charge recorded in the complaints against him was that his men broke her limbs until her mind gave way. He blackmailed widows into signing over estates. He held one noblewoman until she surrendered her lands, and contemporaries believed the treatment she got in custody destroyed her. When the barons of the Welsh March rose against him in 1321 and forced his exile, he spent it as a pirate in the Channel, robbing merchant ships. And then Edward brought him home, crushed the rebel earls at Boroughbridge, beheaded the Earl of Lancaster, the king's own first cousin, outside his own castle, and hanged so many knights around the country that contemporaries wrote about the shock of seeing gentle blood swinging from town gallows like common thieves. The Despensers came back from that stronger than any subjects in England, and Hugh the Younger attached himself to the king so closely that people at court began saying about him exactly what they had once said about Gaveston, except now with fear mixed in. Isabella hated him, and he worked to destroy her. During the war scare with France in 1324, her position curdled overnight. She was suddenly an enemy alien, the sister of the hostile French king, and on that pretext her estates were confiscated, her income cut to a fraction, her French servants arrested and packed off, and, cruelest of all, her 3 younger children were taken from her keeping and placed with Despenser allies. Despenser's own wife, Eleanor, was installed in the Queen's household, and reports reached France that Eleanor was opening Isabella's letters, that the Queen of England could not write to her family without her enemy's wife reading it first. Isabella went quiet and correct. She attended court. She smiled where required. Whatever she was actually doing behind that composure, the next 2 years would make clear. In 1325, a door opened, and she walked through it without hesitating. The war with France needed settling, and the obvious negotiator was the one person trusted on both sides of the Channel, the French king's sister, who happened to be the English king's wife. Edward and Despenser let her go to Paris, and you can only assume Despenser considered it a win, the inconvenient queen shipped abroad. She negotiated a settlement, and the settlement required the English king to come and pay homage for Gascony in person, and Edward wouldn't leave England, partly because Despenser didn't dare stay behind without royal protection, and didn't dare travel to France where half the nobility wanted him dead. A workaround was found. The 12-year-old heir, Prince Edward, would be sent to Paris to perform the homage instead. The boy crossed the Channel in September 1325, and the moment he arrived, his mother had the two things she needed: distance and the air. She refused to come home. Ordered back, she gave the French court a declaration that ambassadors copied down and sent across Europe, saying in substance that marriage was the joining of a man and a woman, that someone had come between her husband and herself, and that until that intruder was removed, she would dress as a widow, as a wife robbed of her lord. And she did. She put on black, a Queen of England at the French court, in mourning clothes for a living husband, with the heir to England at her side. Edward wrote furious letters. He wrote to her brother the king, to the boy, to the Pope. The Pope leaned on the French. Isabella simply moved her operation to the county of Hainault, where the count had 4 daughters and money, and she cut the deal that made the invasion possible: her son's betrothal to the count's daughter Philippa in exchange for cash and a fleet and several hundred professional soldiers. By then Roger Mortimer was at her side, and openly. Mortimer was a marcher baron who had risen against the Despensers in the 1321 war, been condemned to death, had the sentence commuted, and then in August 1323 pulled off one of the great escapes in the Tower of London's history. On the feast night of the Tower's own chapel, when the garrison was celebrating, his allies drugged the wine of the constable and the guards. A sleeping draught mixed into the drink, and Mortimer went out through a hole dug into the kitchen chimney flue, over the roofs, down the wall on a rope ladder, across the Thames in a waiting boat, onto relays of horses to the coast, and out to France. The constable of the Tower woke from a drugged sleep to find his most important prisoner gone, and, deciding that the king's mercy was not something to gamble on, fled the country himself. In Paris, Mortimer joined the exiles gathering around Isabella, and at some point in 1325 or early 1326, the two of them became lovers. This was not whispered. It was reported to Edward, denounced by bishops, discussed in diplomatic correspondence. A married queen and a condemned traitor, living openly as partners while planning war on her husband. The scandal of it, by 14th century standards, is hard to overstate, and she seems to have decided it simply did not matter anymore. The invasion fleet that landed on the Suffolk coast in September 1326 was tiny, around 1,500 men. It didn't need to be bigger. England folded like a tent. Edward summoned his levies, and the levies didn't come, or came and deserted, and within days the king and Despenser were fleeing west out of London with a treasury on pack horses, while the capital dissolved into mob rule behind them. What the London mob did that October gives you the temperature of the country. The Bishop of Exeter, Walter Stapledon, the king's treasurer, hated as the money man of the regime, was caught riding near St. Paul's. The crowd pulled him off his horse, stripped him of his armour and robes, dragged him into Cheapside, and hacked his head off with a bread knife, along with 2 of his servants. His head was sent to Isabella as a gift. Her recorded reaction was disapproval, and Stapledon eventually got a proper burial. But nobody was punished, because the men who could have punished them were busy hunting bigger game. They caught the elder Despenser at Bristol at the end of October. He was in his 60s. The tribunal denied him a defence, mirroring the drumhead justice his side had dealt to Lancaster in 1322, and he was drawn to the gallows in his armour, hanged, then beheaded, and accounts add that his body was hacked apart and thrown to the dogs, with his head sent to Winchester, the town of his earldom, on a spear. His son lasted 3 more weeks. Edward and Hugh the Younger were run down in the hills of South Wales in mid-November, out of options, allegedly heading for the coast and Ireland. And from the moment of his capture, Despenser tried to cheat the sentence he knew was coming by refusing all food and drink. He was starving himself to death on the road, so they hurried the schedule, stopping at Hereford instead of taking him to London, because he was fading too fast to survive the longer trip. What happened at Hereford on the 24th of November 1326 was designed as theatre, and Isabella and Mortimer sat in the audience. Despenser was dressed in a tunic painted with his coat of arms reversed, crowned with nettles, verses from scripture about arrogance scrawled on his skin, and dragged through the town behind 4 horses to the sound of trumpets and a screaming crowd. The charges were read to him at length, and he was allowed no reply. Then he was hauled up a specially built gallows said to be 50 feet tall, high enough for the whole city to watch, hanged until he was nearly gone, and cut down alive. He was tied to a ladder, and the executioner castrated him, burning what was cut away in a fire in front of his eyes, then opened his belly and drew out his entrails and burned those too, and the accounts say he was alive for a good part of it, that a great roar went up from the crowd. His heart was cut out and thrown in the fire. Only then was he beheaded. His head went to London Bridge, his quarters to 4 towns around the kingdom. Froissart, writing later and not always reliably on detail, has Isabella and Mortimer feasting while they watched. Even if you set the feasting aside as embroidery, they were there. She watched it done. Edward II was, technically, still king through all of this, held at Kenilworth Castle. And in January 1327, a delegation came to him with a choice dressed up as a choice: abdicate in favour of your son or be deposed in favour of nobody in particular, and the realm might look elsewhere entirely. He wept through the meeting, fainted at one point into the arms of the men beside him, and gave up the crown. The boy became Edward III at 14, with his mother and Mortimer holding every lever behind him, and the old king became a problem with a pulse. They moved him in April to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire into the custody of Mortimer's son-in-law, and the chronicles collect stories about his treatment there, that he was kept over a pit of rotting animal carcasses in the hope the vapours would sicken him, that he was fed foul food, humiliated, shaved with ditch water by the roadside. Some of that comes from writers hostile to the regime and telescopes into legend. What's documented and remarkable is that his supporters would not stop trying to free him, and in July 1327, a band led by a Dominican friar named Thomas Dunhavard actually stormed Berkeley and got him out for a short time before he was recaptured. Another rescue plot surfaced in September, and on the night of the 21st of September 1327, Edward of Caernarfon died in his room at Berkeley Castle, at the age of 43, in perfect convenient time. The court announced he had died of natural causes, a sorrow of the spirit, grief. The body was embalmed quickly, watched over by a small circle, displayed only at a distance, and buried in December at Gloucester with full royal honours. Isabella and the young king attending, the widow doing her mourning in public. That's version 1, and it's the version put out by the people with the most to hide. Within a few years, chronicles start saying he was suffocated. Later chronicles, growing more confident as the regime that could punish them fell, add the story everyone knows, that he was pinned under a door or a table and killed with a red-hot spit or plumber's iron driven up into his bowels through a horn so that no mark would show on the body and that his screams were heard beyond the castle walls. That account appears and elaborates over the following decades, and it fit the appetite of the age perfectly, a death that punished the sin his enemies accused him of, murder as sermon. Historians have chewed on it ever since. The earliest sources closest to the event say nothing of the sort. The men later charged with his murder were accused of the killing itself, with no method entered in the record, and there's a stranger document still, a letter written in the 1330s by a papal official named Manuel Fieschi, addressed to Edward III himself, laying out in specific, oddly checkable detail a story in which the king was never murdered at all, escaped Berkeley by killing a porter, and ended his days as a hermit in Italy. Most scholars hold that Edward died at Berkeley that September, almost certainly helped out of the world on Mortimer's orders, and with Isabella at minimum content not to ask questions, and that the poker belongs to the chronicle tradition rather than the room. But the honest answer is that the door of that room stays shut. Nobody has ever gotten it open. Isabella and Mortimer ruled England for 4 years, and they ruled it badly in exactly the way they had accused the dispensers of ruling it. Isabella assigned herself a widow's settlement so enormous it swallowed close to 1/3 of royal revenue, and the treasury Edward left behind, a real fortune, evaporated. Mortimer made himself Earl of March, a title nobody had ever held, swaggered through court precedents ahead of men who outranked him, and let the young king feel daily that he was a decoration. The Scottish peace they signed was necessary and everyone hated it anyway, a humiliation with a treaty seal. And in 1330 they crossed the last line. Edmund, Earl of Kent, the dead king's half-brother, a well-meaning and not especially sharp man, was fed reports, some of them likely planted by the regime's own agents, that Edward II was alive and hidden at Corfe Castle. He conspired to free a dead man, was arrested for it, and was condemned. On the day of his execution, he stood by the block for hours, because no one could be found willing to behead a son of Edward I, until finally a convicted latrine cleaner did the job in exchange for a pardon. A prince of the blood executed on the word of Mortimer's tribunal for the crime of believing his brother might be alive. After that, every magnate in England understood that no one was safe, including, most dangerously, the 17-year-old king, whose wife had just given him a son and who was reportedly beginning to fear for his own position. Edward III moved in October 1330 at Nottingham Castle, and he did it like his mother's son, quietly through a tunnel. A secret passage ran up through the sandstone under the castle into the keep, and the castellan showed it to the king's friends. On the night of the 19th of October, a couple dozen armed men came up through the rock into the heart of the castle, joined the king inside, and burst into the Queen Mother's apartments, where Mortimer was in council. 2 of Mortimer's men died in the scuffle at the door. Mortimer was taken alive, and from the next room Isabella, hearing it happen, called out into the dark words the chroniclers record along the lines of, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Her son did not. Mortimer was tried before Parliament, bound and gagged so he could not speak in his own defence, condemned on charges that included the murder of Edward II, and hanged at Tyburn like a common felon, his body left on the gallows for 2 days. And Isabella, the she-wolf, the invader, the woman who had watched Despenser taken apart at Hereford. Nothing happened to her. People never expect that part. Her son took back the vast estates, gave her a generous income, kept her briefly under soft watch, and then simply let her live, and she lived another 28 years, most of them at Castle Rising in Norfolk and other residences, in considerable comfort. Later legend made her a mad woman howling in a tower, and the accounts don't support it, though her grief in the immediate aftermath was reportedly severe. The household records that survive from her old age show hawks and hounds, minstrels, books of romances, relics collected, pilgrimages made, constant visits from her son the king and her grandchildren, one of whom, the Black Prince, seems to have been genuinely fond of her. Toward the end, she took the habit of a Franciscan tertiary, a lay sister of the Order of St. Clare. She died in August 1358, and then came that funeral at Greyfriars, the 50-year-old wedding cloak, and the silver casket on her chest holding the heart of the man whose destruction she had arranged. Whether that was guilt or love surviving everything that had happened, or just the correct gesture of a royal widow who intended to arrive in the next world with her paperwork in order, she never said. She was a Capet to the end. They didn't explain themselves. Isabella got 4 years of ruling England from behind her son before the sun came up through the rock at Nottingham and took it back. 6 centuries before her, on the other side of the world, a woman ran the same arrangement much further. An empire governed first from behind a screen at her husband's shoulder, and then from behind her sons, and when the sons became inconvenient, she removed them, one after another, and mounted the throne under her own name. She remains, to this day, the only woman in more than 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule as emperor outright, and the trail behind her is arguably the darkest in this entire video. Wu ZeTian. Wu Zhao, whom the world knows as Wu ZeTian, was born in 624 to a timber merchant who had backed the Right Rebellion, funding the founder of the Tang dynasty and being rewarded with office and rank, new money grafted onto an aristocratic world that never let the family forget it. The daughter was educated, unusually so, taught to read, to write, to know the histories, and she was, by every account, strikingly beautiful. And at 13 she was summoned into the palace of the Emperor Taizong as a concubine of the 5th rank, a Chiron, one girl among hundreds in the largest gilded filing cabinet on earth. Her mother wept at the gate when she left, and the reply attributed to the girl has her asking how her mother knew this wasn't her great fortune, meeting the Son of Heaven, so why cry? decades later, as emperor, she told her court a story from those years about a stallion called Lion, so violent nobody could ride it, and how she had told Taizong she could master it with three things: an iron whip, an iron hammer for its head if the whip failed, and a dagger for its throat if the hammer failed. She told that story about herself on purpose as a ruler. Take it as her own commentary on everything you're about to hear. Taizong barely noticed her, and by the rules of the palace, her life should have ended, functionally, when his did. When an emperor died, his childless consorts were sent to a convent, and in 649, Wu's head was shaved, and she disappeared into the Ganye temple in grey robes at 25, buried alive in the polite Buddhist way. Except that during the old emperor's final illness, she had been in the sick room, and so had his son and heir, the crown prince Li Ji, and the chronicles are coy and pointed at once about what began at that bedside, an affair between the dying emperor's concubine and the dying emperor's son, incest by the reckoning of the age. The son became the emperor Gaozong, and on the anniversary of his father's death, he went to the temple to offer incense, and the sources describe the young monarch and the shaved nun seeing each other and both weeping. What brought her back through the palace gates, deliciously, was another woman's scheming. Gaozong's empress, the childless Empress Wang, was losing him to a rival consort named Xiao, and she calculated that recalling the pretty nun her husband cried over would split the emperor's affections and weaken Xiao. She personally arranged for Wu's hair to grow back and for her return. She reached into the fire and carried it home in her own hands. Within 3 years, Wu had risen to the second rank of consorts and borne the emperor sons, and Empress Wang and consort Xiao had discovered they were now allies against her. Far too late. Then, in early 654, Wu gave birth to a daughter, and what happened to that baby is the most notorious paragraph in Chinese history, so let me give it to you the way the sources actually deliver it. The account in the 11th century Comprehensive Mirror and in the New Book of Tang before it runs like this. Empress Wang came to visit, played with the infant, and left. Wu, alone, strangled the baby under its blanket and smoothed the covers. When the emperor arrived, Wu greeted him smiling, went to show off the child, and pulled back the blanket on a small corpse and screamed, and demanded of the attendants who had been in the room, and the attendants answered, "Only the empress." The oldest surviving history, compiled 2 centuries closer to the events, says less, that the infant died and Wu accused Wang of killing her. Every history involved was written by Confucian scholars, for whom Wu was the great abomination, a woman on the dragon throne, and they collected every horror about her with an appetite you can feel on the page, and infant death in the 7th century needed no murderer. Set against that, the accusation destroyed Empress Wang exactly on schedule, and the woman it benefited went on to demonstrate repeatedly for 50 years what she was willing to do to human beings who stood in her lane. The chroniclers may have invented the crime. They did not have to invent the character. I'll leave the blanket in your hands. Wang fell within the year, finished off by a sorcery accusation, deposed alongside consort Xiao and imprisoned, while the old guard of statesmen who resisted the change were shouted down, one venerable chancellor beating his head bloody on the palace steps in protest, another finally shrugging that whom the emperor married was the emperor's family affair. And in November 655, Wu was installed as Empress of China. What happened to the two deposed women a few months later comes down in the histories with details nobody has ever managed to soften. Gaozong, wandering the palace, came upon the sealed compound where Wang and Xiao were held, a bricked-up place with food passed through a hatch, and was overcome, calling to them, and the women wept through the wall and begged him to name their prison the courtyard of remembrance, and the emperor, moved, said he would see to things. Word reached Wu within hours. She sent men to the compound with orders that each woman receive 100 lashes of the cane, and then that their hands and feet be cut off, and the accounts say the maimed women were thrown into a large vat of wine, with Wu remarking that the two witches could now get drunk to their bones. They took days to die, by the telling. Consort Xiao spent her last strength on a curse, that in the next life Wu be born a rat and she a cat, so she could tear her throat out lifetime after lifetime, and the detail that gives the story its footing, in fact, is what the palace did afterward. Cats were banned from the imperial residences, and the empress began to be troubled at night, seeing the two women, it was said, hair unbound and dripping blood, until she moved out of the palace where they died, and increasingly out of the capital altogether, favoring the eastern city of Luoyang for the rest of her life. Whatever happened in that compound, Wu behaved for 50 years like a woman who knew. Gaozong's health handed her the empire. From 660 he suffered attacks the sources describe as dizziness and failing sight, likely strokes, and Wu began processing the state's paperwork, and soon she sat at audiences behind a screen at his shoulder, and officials began speaking of the two saints ruling together. One serious attempt was made to stop her, in 664, when the emperor, alarmed by her dominance, had a chancellor named Shangguan Yi secretly draft an edict of deposition. Wu, whose informants were already everywhere, walked in while the ink was wet. Her husband folded on the spot and blamed the chancellor, and Shangguan Yi and his son were executed, and the family enslaved. And here the story throws off one of those sparks history sometimes produces, because among the enslaved was Shangguan Yi's infant granddaughter, Wana, raised as a palace slave, who grew into such a prodigy of letters that Wu made her, of all people, her personal secretary, and for decades the edicts of the woman who had destroyed the family were drafted by the granddaughter of the man she'd beheaded. The court her family died opposing became the girl's entire world, and she served its mistress brilliantly. Make of that pair whatever you will. Her own sons went through her one by one, like men wading into the same river. The eldest, Li Hong, the crown prince, was capable and humane, and he made the mistake of pity, discovering that consort Xiao's two daughters, princesses of the blood, had been locked away in the palace unmarried into their 30s. Decades of quiet vengeance against their dead mother, and petitioning that they be released and wed. His mother married them off to common guards officers, and the relationship never recovered, and in 675, at 1123, Li Hong died suddenly after dining with his parents. The histories pass on the whisper of poison in his cup, and also record he had been ill for years, and the whisper survives because of everything around it. The second son, Li Xian, inherited the title and the problem. Court gossip, which the histories preserve, said he was really the child of Wu's own sister, one of several of Wu's close relatives, who had died conveniently over the years, and a ballad began to circulate about a mother picking melons from a vine, 1, 2, 3, until the vine comes home bare. Armor was found stashed in his stables in 680, treason by possession, and he was exiled to the far southwest, and in 684, weeks after his father finally died, his mother's envoy arrived at his place of exile, and he was made to hang himself. Son 3, Zhongzong, actually reached the throne on Gaozong's death and held it for 6 weeks, long enough to try to promote his father-in-law and to snap, when challenged, that he could give the whole empire to his father-in-law if he pleased. His mother had him lifted bodily off the throne at an assembly, demoted and exiled with his pregnant wife. Son 4, Ruizong, was installed as emperor and kept in an inner palace, never appearing at audiences, an emperor in storage, while his mother ruled openly as regent for a grown man everyone knew would never be allowed to reign. Rebellion came and told her exactly how strong she was. A rising in 684 under disgruntled aristocrats collapsed in weeks, and its most lasting product was its manifesto, a magnificent denunciation of Wu, written by the poet Luo Binwang, cataloguing her crimes, the murdered empress, the poisoned kin, the smothered daughter, and when it was read to Wu, she asked who had written it, and on being told, remarked that it was the chancellor's failure that a talent like that had been left to drift to the rebels. She meant it. She spent her whole reign hoovering up ability wherever it grew, expanding the examination system, promoting nobodies over blue bloods, interviewing candidates herself, and those same years, the very same years, produced the machinery of terror. In 686, a bronze petition box went up outside the palace with 4 slots, one of them for secret denunciations, and any informer of any station was entitled to post horses and official meals to bring accusations to the capital, rewarded if the charge stuck, unpunished if it didn't. The men who rose on that river of paper became the most feared names of the age, Zhou Xing and Lai Junchen, a convicted criminal turned inquisitor, who co-wrote an actual procedural manual on fabricating conspiracy cases, and whose prisons ran named tortures, the phoenix spreading its wings, the donkey, iron bands around the skull tightened with wedges until, in at least one recorded case, the eyes started from the head, and most prisoners, the histories note, confessed at the sight of the instruments, at which point their confessions implicated the next names, and the machine fed itself. In 688, the machine was pointed at the imperial family itself. Summoned to the capital for a grand ceremony, the princes of the House of Tang panicked, rose piecemeal, and were destroyed piecemeal, and in the aftermath the dynasty's own clan was gutted, dozens of princes executed or driven to suicide, their families exterminated or enslaved, infants included in the sentences, until the founding family of the dynasty scarcely existed outside her own descendants. With the board cleared, she stopped pretending. Petitions poured in through 690, tens of thousands of signatures, officials, commoners, monks, and, the records solemnly note, reports of auspicious birds and stones, begging her to take the throne, a campaign as spontaneous as a military parade. Backed by a Buddhist text her clerics circulated identifying her as a prophesied female divinity destined to rule the world. Her son, the storage emperor, duly petitioned to step aside and to be granted, please, his mother's surname. In October 690, at 66, she proclaimed a new dynasty, the Zhou, and took the title Huangdi, Emperor, and invented a new character for her personal name, Zhao, the sun and moon together shining over the void. A concubine of the 5th rank, a shaved nun, now the son of heaven. Whatever the century, that climb has no parallel, and neither does the bill. Her instruments eventually went into the fire after everyone else. In 691, the Inquisitor Zhou Xing was himself denounced, and Wu handed the case, with what reads like deliberate wit, to his colleague Lai Junchen, who invited Zhou to dinner and asked professionally how one might make a stubborn prisoner confess. "Simple," said Zhou. "You take a great jar, heat it with charcoal fires all around, and put the man inside." Lai had the jar brought and the fires lit, then stood and informed his guest of the accusation against him and said, "Please step into the jar." Zhou Xing confessed on the spot, was spared and exiled, and was killed on the road by the family of one of his victims. Lai Junchen lasted until 697, when he overreached toward the princesses and the great clans and went to the execution ground himself, and Luoyang's crowds fell on his corpse, gouging out the eyes, slicing the flesh, trampling what remained into the mud, a public review of his career submitted in person. Old age softened her grip on nothing except herself. In her 70s, she took up 2 brothers, Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong, young, powdered, rouged courtiers who controlled access to her sick room and grew intolerable to the entire government, and defending them cost her the last thing she had left to spend. In 701, her own 17-year-old grandson, his teenage sister Princess Yongtai, and the princess's husband were reported for privately criticizing the brothers' place at court, and all 3 died for it, forced suicides or beaten to death depending on the source, and here the ground itself has added testimony, because Yongtai's tomb was excavated in 1960, and the epitaph inside says the princess died in childbirth the day after her brother's death, and her pelvis suggested she was very young and slight. And you can read the epitaph as covering the crime or recording a girl whose labor began amid the destruction of her household, and the stone and the chronicle just sit there, side by side, not quite agreeing. She was buried, later, with imperial honors by her father, the same Zhongzong who had been lifted off the throne once he got it back. Wu was around 80, sick, isolated in an inner palace with only the Zhang brothers in attendance, and her chief ministers came for her with 500 guards. The brothers were cut down in the gallery, beheaded, their heads displayed on a bridge in Luoyang for the crowds. The soldiers came onto the bedchamber, and the old woman sat up and asked who was making the disturbance, and, seeing her son Zhongzong standing sheepishly among the armed men, told him in effect, "Oh, it's you. Then you may as well go back to your palace," and worked down the line of conspirators, reminding individual ministers exactly whose patronage had made them, until one of them, the histories say, could not stop weeping. She abdicated the next day. They moved her to a subsidiary palace with her titles intact and treated her carefully, and a courtier who saw her in those last months recorded that the woman famous for appearing ageless had stopped painting her face and looked, at last, like what she was, haggard and old and finished. She died that December, and her final recorded instruction was its own small astonishment that her imperial title be set aside and that she be buried as what she had begun as Empress Consort, wife of Gaozong, and it was done. And she was sealed into the mountain tomb of Qianling beside the husband she had ruled and outlived by 22 years. 2 stone tablets stand on the approach to that tomb. One is Gaozong's, and it carries a long inscription in praise of him, composed by Wu herself. The other one is hers, a monolith over 7 meters tall, quarried, hauled, dressed, carved with dragons around the crown of it, stood upright before her grave, and left, on its face, completely blank. The wordless stele. No one recorded why. Some say she ordered it herself, that her deeds were beyond words, and you're free to hear that either way. Some say her son couldn't decide what could safely be written about a mother like that, and chose nothing. Some say the blank was an invitation, that later ages should judge her and carve the verdict themselves. Centuries of visitors took the invitation literally, and travelers and officials of later dynasties scratched their own inscriptions into the empty face, poems, records of their visits, graffiti and dead scripts, so the stone isn't truly blank anymore. 1,300 years of other people's words, and still, on the tomb of Wu ZeTian, not one of them is hers. Wu's judges at least left her stone blank. The next woman got her verdict written while she was still alive, printed, translated across Europe, and eventually put on a London stage, and the authors were survivors of the worst night of her reign. In France, they mostly just called her the Italian woman, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine was an orphan before she was a month old. Born in Florence in April 1519 to Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and a French noblewoman, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, and within days her mother was dead of childbed fever, and within 3 weeks her father was dead too, of the illnesses he'd been carrying into the marriage. The Florentines called the baby the Duchessina, the little Duchess, and she was passed between grandmother, aunt, and convents, while the men of her family, who happened to include 2 popes, moved her around the board. When she was 8, the Medici were overthrown in Florence, and the new republic kept the little girl as, functionally, a hostage, and when her cousin the Pope sent an imperial army to besiege the city in 1529, 10-year-old Catherine was inside the walls, in a convent, as the most valuable Medici body the Republic possessed. The records of the Republic's councils during that siege preserve the proposals made about her out loud in session. One councillor suggested lowering her in a basket over the walls to hang in the path of her family's cannon. Another proposed placing her in a brothel, soldiers first, so that when the siege ended, no prince in Europe would marry her, and the Medici would have lost their asset. She knew about this. When soldiers came to move her from her convent to a more secure one, the 11-year-old cut her hair off and put on a nun's habit, and dared them, in effect, to drag a bride of Christ through the streets of Florence. They took her anyway, on a donkey, through crowds that hated her name, but the habit and the haircut apparently unsettled the escort enough to be remembered. The siege ended in famine and plague, the Republic fell, and Catherine came out alive, which was not the likeliest outcome, and everything about how she operated for the rest of her life, the patience, the watchfulness, the refusal to trust any position as permanent, was forged in that city. Her uncle, Pope Clement VII, then sold her at the top of the market. In 1533, at 14, she was married to Henry of Orleans, second son of the King of France, also 14 at Marseille. In festivities so lavish, the bills survive as a scandal in their own right. The Pope stayed in town to make sure the marriage was consummated, and King Francis, by the reports that circulated, observed the young couple put to bed and pronounced afterward that each had shown valor in the joust. 16th century royal privacy, in one sentence. 10 months later, Clement died. The unpaid balance of her dowry died with him, and the French court woke up to find it had bought an Italian banker's granddaughter at a princess's price for an alliance that no longer existed. She was 14, foreign, suddenly worthless in the currency that mattered, and she responded by making herself impossible to dislike, learning the hunt, riding better than the court ladies, introducing the side saddle position that let her show off a good leg, waiting out the contempt. Two things then made her position close to unbearable. In 1536, her husband's older brother died suddenly after drinking iced water following a tennis match, and his Italian cupbearer, a member of Catherine's own arrived household, was accused of poisoning him, tortured into a confession, and publicly torn apart by 4 horses. The likeliest cause of the Dauphin's death was illness. But the association of Italian and poison entered Catherine's file that year and never left it, and now her husband was heir to France, and the second thing was that her husband belonged entirely to another woman. Diane de Poitiers was almost 20 years older than Henry, a widow of legendary discipline and beauty, and Henry had fixed on her in boyhood and never moved. He wore her colours in the lists. He entwined his initial with hers on his buildings, an H and 2 crescent Ds, and courtiers noticed you could squint at the monogram and read it as containing a C, which was the closest Catherine got to inclusion. Diane ran his heart, his schedule, and eventually pieces of his policy. Brantôme, a court gossip writing later and to be taken with salt, tells the story that Catherine had holes bored in the floor above the chamber where Henry and Diane met, and watched and wept afterward, saying she had seen nothing deserving of that happiness. A later, unverifiable story, but nobody who reads her situation finds it implausible. And through her first decade of marriage, no children. In a queen in waiting, that's a death sentence with paperwork pending, and repudiation was openly discussed at court. Catherine went to work on the problem with the desperation the stakes deserved, and the remedies she submitted to are in the record because everyone around her talked. She drank mule's urine. She wore poultices of ground stag's antler and cow dung on her body. She consulted every physician, astrologer and charlatan the age could supply. And, in the move that shows you her spine, she went to King Francis herself, knelt, and offered to accept repudiation and serve whichever bride replaced her, and the old king was moved and kept her. Diane de Poitiers, of all people, helped save her too, on pure self-interest, since a new young wife might displace a mistress where the Baron Italian never would, and the accounts agree Diane would send Henry from her own bed to his wife's on the calendar's fertile days. Whatever combination of medicine and persistence did it, in January 1544, Catherine delivered a son, and then simply did not stop. 10 children in 12 years, 7 surviving infancy. The last delivery, twin girls in 1556, nearly killed her. 1 twin died in the womb, and the surgeons broke the dead child's legs to bring her out and save the mother. An obstetric horror, she survived at 37, and the physicians told Henry there could be no more, and even that had a court politics edge, since her doctors were relieved, and Diane's faction reportedly was too. Henry became king in 1547 and gave his wife honor and no power. The power went to Diane and to the Guise brothers, and Catherine bore it for 12 years, and then the summer of 1559 happened. Peace with Spain had been sealed with 2 weddings, Catherine's daughter Elizabeth to Philip of Spain, Mary Tudor's fresh widower, and the king's sister to the Duke of Savoy. And Paris threw a 5-day tournament in the Rue Saint-Antoine. The street cleared and sanded for the lists in front of the royal residence. On the 30th of June, Henry, 40 and vain of his form, ran courses against the captain of his Scottish Guard, Gabriel de Montgomery. Their last pass went wrong, the lances shattered, and shards of Montgomery's broken lance drove up under the king's gilded visor, one splinter through the eye and into the head, another tearing into the temple and throat. He stayed conscious long enough to be helped from his horse. Catherine watched it from the stands. What followed was 10 days of the best medicine of the century failing in slow motion. Ambroise Paré, the great surgeon probing the wound, Vesalius himself, the founder of modern anatomy, summoned up from Brussels by Philip. And, in a detail that stops most people, the doctors had the heads of 4 freshly executed criminals brought from the Paris prisons and drove broken lance shafts into them at the angle of the wound, trying to model on dead men what was happening inside the living king. It didn't matter. Infection and the injury did their work, and Henry died on the 10th of July in what the accounts describe as terrible pain. Court gossip immediately dug up a quatrain Nostradamus had published years before, about a young lion overcoming an old one on the field of combat, piercing his eyes in a cage of gold. Catherine had patronized Nostradamus since 1555. The association between this widow and the occult now had a corpse to anchor it. Her mourning was total, and it was also a flag she planted. French queens traditionally mourned in white. Catherine put on black and wore it for the remaining 30 years of her life, took a broken lance as her personal emblem with a motto about tears and grief, and, in her one act of revenge on the woman who had owned her marriage, banned Diane de Poitiers from the dying king's chamber, then required the return of the crown jewels, and took back the chateau of Chenonceau, swapping Diane a lesser one for it. She didn't imprison her, didn't ruin her, just removed her, completely, like staging furniture. People underestimated Catherine for 30 years running, and that little sequence is usually where readers stop doing it. Her eldest son, Francis, was 15, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, and dead within 17 months of an ear infection that abscessed toward the brain. The next son, Charles, was 10, and Catherine seized the regency with both hands and became, in title and fact, the governor of France, and inherited a kingdom already tearing itself apart along the Catholic and Protestant seam. Her instinct, and the record is fairly generous to her on this, was toleration as policy, and she spelled out her reasoning herself in letters, that you could not cut the Huguenots out of France without cutting France apart. She staged a formal debate between the confessions. She issued an edict in January 1562 giving Protestants limited legal rights of worship, further than any Catholic crown in Europe had gone. 2 months later, the Duke of Guise's retinue caught a Huguenot congregation worshipping in a barn at Vassy and killed several dozen of them, and the wars began, and they would outlive her. What those wars normalized is the backdrop you need for what's coming: massacre and counter-massacre, prisoners drowned in rivers by both sides, a nobility conducting private wars under religious flags, and after one failed Protestant coup early on, the conspiracy of Amboise, the court itself watched from the chateau balconies as the captured plotters were beheaded and hanged in batches. Bodies strung from the iron railings of the chateau and dumped in the Loire, until the smell drove the court to move house. Catherine's younger children were raised in that, and it shows later when you meet them as adults. For a decade she zigzagged, fought the Huguenots when their prince-generals rose, negotiated with them when they held, dragged the boy king on a 2-year progress around the entire kingdom to show him to France. Legend attached itself to her methods as she went. The most durable piece is the flying squadron, the escadron volant, her travelling corps of dozens of well-born, beautiful ladies-in-waiting, alleged to have been deployed into the beds of great nobles as intelligence assets. The core of it comes from Brantôme and hostile pamphlets, and it grew luxuriant in the retelling. And it has some documented roots. There are real cases. A maid of honor named Isabelle de Limeuil ended up pregnant by the Prince de Condé, the leading Huguenot, and disgraced. And whether Catherine had aimed her or merely failed to stop her depends on whose account you buy. The poisoning file is similar. Her perfumer, Irina of Florence, sold gloves and scents and, rumor insisted, other preparations. And when Jeanne d'Albret, the fierce Protestant Queen of Navarre, came to Paris in June 1572 to buy clothes for her son's wedding and died there suddenly, Huguenot presses said Catherine had killed her with a pair of poisoned gloves from René's shop. An autopsy was performed, unusual for the time, and found disease in the lungs consistent with tuberculosis and pleurisy. The glove story outran the autopsy by about 4 centuries and is still running. That wedding Jeanne had been shopping for is the center of everything. Catherine's daughter Marguerite was to marry Jeanne's son, Henry of Navarre, the young Protestant prince of the blood, a marriage designed to weld the two Frances together. And in August 1572, the entire Huguenot leadership came to Catholic Paris for it, into a sweltering, overcrowded, fanatically Catholic city that regarded the wedding as blasphemy. The ceremony went ahead on the 18th, on a platform outside Notre Dame, so the Protestant groom wouldn't have to attend Mass. 4 days later, on the 22nd, Admiral Coligny, the Huguenots' revered military leader, who had gained real influence over the young King Charles that summer, was walking back from the Louvre when an arquebus fired from a lattice window of a house connected to the Guise clientele. The shot tore off his right index finger and shattered his left arm, and Paré, the same surgeon from the dead king's bedside, cut away the mangled finger with scissors and dug the ball out of the arm, while Coligny stayed composed enough that witnesses marveled. The assassination attempt failed, and its failure created the crisis. Thousands of armed, enraged Huguenot gentlemen in the city demanding justice, talk of them seizing the king's person. The court terrified of a Protestant rising, and the Paris mob straining for a Catholic one. On the night of the 23rd at the Louvre, the decision was taken. And the composition of that meeting and the exact words in it are the most argued over blank space in French history. Catherine was there, her son Anjou was there, senior advisors, and at some point the 22-year-old king was brought to agree that the Huguenot military leadership, a list of somewhere between a few dozen and 70 names, would be killed that night, preemptively, before they could rise. Memoir accounts written years later give Charles a shrieking capitulation to the effect that if they were to be killed, then kill them all, so that no one would be left to reproach him, and those memoirs are late and self-serving, and the quote should wear its warning label. What is certain is the order went out, and before dawn on St. Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, the Duke of Guise's men went to Coligny's lodging. His guards were killed on the stairs. A soldier called Besme ran the wounded admiral through as he prayed, and the body was thrown from the window into the courtyard so Guise could confirm the face, and the head was cut off, and reports at the time said it was embalmed and sent toward Rome. The Paris crowd took the rest of him. Hands hacked off, genitals hacked off, the trunk dragged through the gutters for 3 days by relays of enthusiasts, burned, dunked in the Seine, and finally hung up by the heels on the great gibbet of Montfaucon, where the court, including by several accounts the king himself, rode out to view it. Then the plan, if it was ever really a plan, lost its edges. The tocsin rang from the tower of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, the church across from the Louvre, the signal for the targeted killings, and the city heard it as permission. Inside the Louvre itself, the Protestant gentlemen who had come for the wedding, the groom's own entourage, were called down into the courtyard and killed one by the Swiss guard on the pavement, their bodies stacked. Henry of Navarre, the 4-day bridegroom, was spared on condition of converting, and would spend the next years as a hostage of the court. Out in the streets, the militia and the mob took over, chains dragged across the streets to close the quarters, white crosses chalked onto hats so Catholics would know each other, doors of known Protestants marked and broken. For 3 days, Paris murdered its neighbors. Around 2,000 to 3,000 people died in the city, and the record preserves the texture. Families dragged out of hiding places their neighbors knew about. A scholar of European fame, Ramus, killed and thrown from a window, and his body given to students to mutilate. A bookseller roasted over a fire of his own books. Infants recorded thrown into the river. The bodies stripped for their clothes, carted to the bridges, tipped into the Seine, until downstream towns saw corpses coming past on the current for days. In the cemetery of the innocents, a hawthorn tree flowered out of season, and preachers declared it a miracle of heaven's approval, and the killings surged again on the news. Copycat massacres rolled through the provinces for weeks. Orléans, Lyon, where hundreds of Huguenots were penned in the archbishop's prisons and butchered after even the public executioner declined the work, Rouen, Toulouse, Bordeaux, into October. The total dead across France lands somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 in most modern estimates, with contemporary claims ranging far higher. In Rome, the guns of Castel Sant'Angelo fired a salute, a Te Deum was sung, and the Pope struck a commemorative medal showing an angel with a sword standing over fallen Huguenots. Philip of Spain, Catherine's own son-in-law, was reported by a diplomat to have laughed aloud at the news, noted as the only time anyone had seen him do it. How much of that is on Catherine is the question her name has carried ever since, and I'll lay the pieces out and leave them with you. Nothing survives in her hand ordering anything. The strike on the Huguenot leadership almost certainly issued from the council she dominated, and the balance of evidence has her at the center of that decision, whether as its author or as the person who talked a panicking son into it. The citywide slaughter and the provincial ones ran on malicious zeal and neighborly hatred that no order from the Louvre could have switched off. And the Crown actually issued orders to stop the killing that were ignored for days. Huguenot pamphleteers didn't bother with these distinctions. Within 2 years, a best-selling tract had assembled the full black legend, the Italian woman poisoner, student of Machiavelli, murderer of France, and Protestant Europe printed it for centuries, and Marlowe put her on the London stage as a stage devil while people who had known her were still alive. Modern historians mostly describe a limited, panicked political assassination that detonated a religious pogrom beyond anyone's control. Sit with whichever version the evidence leaves you holding. Her own recorded behavior afterward was, characteristically, composure. She attended the reopening of the courts. She wrote to her ambassadors framing it as the punishment of a conspiracy. Whatever she felt stayed off the page. Charles IX did not manage composure. His health collapsed over the following 2 years, tuberculosis, and the accounts of his death in 1574, at 23, describe hemorrhages so severe that observers wrote of the king sweating blood, sheets soaked red, and partisan sources give him deathbed cries about the blood and the murdered, which may be propaganda, and may be a dying young man doing exactly what a dying young man would do. His Huguenot nurse sat with him at the end. Catherine transferred everything to her favorite son, Henry III, whom she had already maneuvered onto the elected throne of Poland, and who now abandoned Poland in the night, literally fled Krakow ahead of pursuing Polish horsemen, to come home and be King of France. For him, she worked another 15 years, an old woman with gout riding hundreds of miles through winter mud to negotiate with rebels, holding the kingdom together with string, while the wars ground on and her children died around her. Charles, then her youngest son in 1584, until the Valois line hung on Henry III alone, childless. Her occult reputation kept growing alongside, and she fed it, employing the Ruggieri brothers, Florentine astrologers, one of whom was repeatedly arrested for sorcery and wax figures, and kept being released, building an observatory column beside her Paris palace, where she and Ruggieri watched the stars. And the column, oddly enough, is still standing in Paris today, next to the old Corn Exchange, one of the only pieces of her buildings left. A prophecy attached to her late in life said she would die near Saint-Germain, so she avoided the places, stopped residing where the parish of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois could claim her, steered around Chateau with the name. In December 1588, at the Chateau of Blois, her son had the Duke of Guise, who by then effectively controlled Paris against the crown, summoned to the royal chamber and stabbed to death by the king's gentlemen. A murder committed one floor above the apartments where Catherine lay sick in bed, and the accounts have Henry coming down afterward to tell his mother that he was now King of France at last, without a rival, and her replies, as reported, run from dread to a dry warning that cutting is easier than sewing. She understood instantly what her son did not, that killing Guise made every Catholic in France the crown's enemy. 13 days later, on the 5th of January 1589, she died at Blois, of pleurisy on top of everything else. And the priest who happened to attend her at the end, the story went around immediately, was a chaplain named Julien de Saint-Germain. Paris, held by Guise's League, celebrated her death from the pulpits, and it was made clear that if her body were brought to the royal tombs at Saint-Denis, the crowd would throw it in the Seine. She was buried in a plain grave in Blois, and left there for decades until a kinswoman moved her to Saint-Denis, and during the Revolution the tombs were emptied anyway, and her bones went into a pit with the rest of the kings. 8 months after her death, a fanatic monk stabbed Henry III in the abdomen, and the dynasty she had spent 30 years in black trying to preserve was extinct, and the throne passed to the Protestant bridegroom of that August wedding, Henry of Navarre. Catherine ruled through her sons because ruling in her own name was never on the table for a queen of France. 800 years before her, in Constantinople, an empress faced the same wall, ruling through a son as regent, watching the clock run down toward the day he wouldn't need her. Her solution is the reason she's in this video, and it happened in a room lined with purple stone. Irene came out of Athens, an orphan girl from a provincial notable's family. She sailed into Constantinople under imperial escort to marry the heir to the Byzantine throne, a match so far above her station that historians still argue about how it happened, possibly through one of the bride shows the court staged, lining up candidates for inspection like horses at a fair. The city she arrived in was the largest and richest in the Christian world, and it was at war with itself over pictures. Her new father-in-law, the Emperor Constantine V, was the great iconoclast, the icon smasher, convinced that venerating images of Christ and the saints was idolatry, and his enforcement had teeth. monks who resisted were blinded, had their beards soaked in oil and set alight, were paraded through the hippodrome hand in hand, with women to break their vows in public. Irene came from Athens, which loved its icons, and she is generally believed to have arrived loving them too, and to have kept that entirely to herself, because the emperor made prospective brides swear against the images. A later story, told with a hostile edge, has two icons discovered hidden under her pillow after her marriage, and her husband Leo refusing her bed over it. However much of that is true, it captures the arrangement. An iconophile woman embedded in the iconoclast dynasty, smiling, waiting. Her son was born in January 771, in a room this story will walk back into before it's done. The Porphyra, the purple chamber of the great palace, a room walled and floored in porphyry, the imperial purple stone, where empresses of Byzantium gave birth so that their children would be porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, legitimacy you could point at. Irene delivered Constantine VI in that room. Leo IV ruled 5 years and died in September 780 at the age of 30, and the chroniclers who hated his dynasty's theology gave his death a moral. He had a passion for jewels, the story runs, and took a magnificent votive crown from the great church, one studded with gems, and wore it. And his head erupted in carbuncles, and a violent fever carried him off, sacrilege collecting its invoice. Some later whispers wondered whether the young widow helped the fever along. Nothing supports that beyond the convenience, and the convenience was total. Irene was about 25, and her son, the new emperor of the Romans, was 9, and she became regent of the empire. 6 weeks in, the establishment tried to remove her. A conspiracy formed to crown Nikephoros, one of Leo's 5 half-brothers, a grown man of the imperial house, the obvious correction to the anomaly of a woman holding the palace. Irene's response set the pattern for everything after. The plotters were flogged, tonsured and exiled, and the 5 half-brothers, the Caesars, were forcibly ordained as priests. And then, the touch that shows her mind, on Christmas Day 780, she had all 5 of them serve communion to the congregation in Hagia Sophia, in front of the whole city. Every soul in Constantinople watched imperial princes handling the chalice, and understood that men in holy orders could never wear the crown. She hadn't shed a drop of their blood, and she had politically neutered every adult male alternative to her son in one liturgy. People kept expecting Irene to behave like a caretaker. This was somebody playing a much longer game. The game's centerpiece was the icons. Reversing half a century of imperial religious policy meant overturning a church council and defying an army that credited its victories to iconoclast emperors, and she did it in stages, cold-bloodedly. Her first attempt at a new council in Constantinople in 786 was broken up by soldiers of the Guards regiments who burst into the church with weapons while the bishops sat. Irene adjourned, waited, and the next year announced a campaign against the Arabs, marched those loyal iconoclast regiments out of the capital, had them disarmed and disbanded far from home. Their families reportedly shipped out after them and replaced them with troops she could trust. Then she reconvened the council at Nicaea, safely away from the capital's mobs. And in 787, the Second Council of Nicaea restored the veneration of icons across the Christian world. Whatever else is in her ledger, and plenty is coming, that council is why the Orthodox Church would end up regarding her with gratitude, and it stands to this day as the last council both the Eastern and Western churches accept. A destitute orphan from Athens rewrote Christian doctrine. She was in her mid-30s. The problem growing in the palace all the while was her own success's expiration date, because the boy emperor was becoming a man emperor, and Irene showed no intention of stepping back. She had betrothed him at 10 to Charlemagne's daughter Rotrud, and the boy, by the accounts, formed a genuine attachment to the idea of his Frankish bride, learning about her, awaiting her. When relations with the Franks soured, and, likely more to the point, when a foreign marriage alliance began to look like a lever her son could use against her, Irene broke the betrothal. In its place, she staged a bride show, 13 candidates fetched from across the empire and paraded, and she picked one for him, a pious girl named Maria from a family in Paphlagonia, safely without dangerous connections. Constantine, 17, protested that he loved another, and was overruled by his mother in his own marriage in his own empire. The chronicler notes he took it badly and never took to Maria, and honestly, the file on Constantine VI from here on reads like a study of a young man deliberately kept incompetent. Irene had controlled his education, his marriage, his access to command, and when, in 790, he finally conspired to shake her off, her reaction was to have his friends flogged and exiled, and the young emperor himself confined and slapped down like a page boy, and then she overreached, demanding the army swear an oath placing her name before his. The regiments of Armenia refused to put a woman's name ahead of the emperor's. The refusal spread, and the army handed sole power to Constantine and packed Irene off to her private palace, her chief eunuch flogged and exiled. 2 years later, her son invited her back and restored her titles, and if you want a single decision that killed him, it's that one. She came back, and she came back watching him fail, and he failed constantly. In July 792, he led the army against the Bulgars at Marseilles and charged into a catastrophe. The camp lost, favorites and generals dead, the emperor running for the capital, and the humiliated troops began muttering about crowning his uncle Nikephoros, the same Caesar-turned-priest from 780. Constantine's answer came from his mother's playbook, with none of her restraint. He had his uncle Nikephoros blinded, and the tongues of his other 4 uncles slit. Blinding, in Byzantium, was the disqualifying mutilation. An emperor had to be whole, so gouging a rival's eyes removed him from the succession without the sin of outright killing him, though the operation, done with daggers, hot irons, or boiling vinegar, killed plenty of men anyway. When the Armenian regiments rose over the treatment of their general Alexios Mosele, whom Constantine had also blinded despite a safe conduct, he crushed them and had 1,000 prisoners paraded with their faces tattooed in ink with the words "Armeniac plotter." The son Irene had raised was proving to everyone that the mother's cunning had skipped him, and only the cruelty had transmitted. His last support was the church, and he burned that too, and some sources suggest his mother handed him the matches. He tired of Maria, the wife who had been chosen for him, accused her of trying to poison him, a charge nobody appears to have believed, forced her and their daughters into a convent, and in 795 married his mistress Theodote, one of his mother's own ladies-in-waiting. A living wife in a convent, a second marriage blessed by a compliant priest, and the monastic world detonated, the great abbots breaking communion with the palace, and Constantine responded with beatings and exiles for monks, and his popularity with the pious went the way of his popularity with the army. Several Byzantine sources hint, and later historians have taken the hint, that Irene encouraged the Theodote affair, dangled the girl, smoothed the scandalous wedding, knowing exactly what it would cost him. That's inference, from writers who assumed her capable of it, and by this point in the story you can see why they did. By 797 he had no army faction, no church faction, and a mother whose people held the palace. In June, her conspirators tried to seize him at the hippodrome, and he escaped across the strait, and for a few weeks it looked like the provinces might rally to the emperor against his mother, and Theophanes the confessor, the chronicler here, adds the detail that Irene panicked and considered begging terms, until she remembered how many of the officers around Constantine were hers, and sent word that if they didn't deliver him, she would tell him everything they had already betrayed. They delivered him. Her own son was brought back across the water as a prisoner to the great palace, and on the 15th of August, 797, around the 9th hour of the day, in the Porphyra, the purple chamber, the room where 26 years earlier she had given birth to him, the men holding him put out his eyes. Theophanes writes that it was done in a cruel and grievous manner, with the intent that he should die of it, and that the deed was done at his mother's wish. And Theophanes then records that the sun darkened for 17 days, that ships wandered off course in the gloom, and that everyone said the sun had turned away because the emperor had been blinded and his mother had done it. A chronicler's judgment dressed as weather, and it tells you what the empire thought. Whether Constantine died of the blinding is one of those places the sources fork. Some accounts have him dead of the wounds soon after. Others have him surviving, blind, shut away in a private house with Theodote, lingering for years in the dark, out of history. Either way, he never appears in public again, and Irene ruled the Roman Empire alone for 5 years, and did it without apology. Official acts from her sole reign style her not empress but emperor, Basileus, the masculine title, Irene the pious emperor of the Romans, and her gold coinage dropped the customary ancestor or heir from the reverse and simply put her own crowned face on both sides, Irene, front and back, an empire of one. On Christmas Day 800, in Rome, the Pope set an imperial crown on Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and among the justifications offered was that the throne of the Roman Empire was effectively vacant since a woman occupied it. Constantinople took that as the insult of the age, And here the story produces one of history's great unconsummated marriages, because by 802, envoys were moving between the two courts, discussing a match between Charlemagne and Irene. The two empires joined in one bed, East and West reunited by a wedding, and Theophanes says Irene was inclined to accept. Her own court killed it. The eunuch Etios, who was maneuvering to secure the succession for his own brother, blocked the negotiations. And while the empress aged and sickened, her ministers circled. On the last day of October 802, while Irene lay ill in her palace, her finance minister Nikephoros had himself crowned emperor at dawn, and the guards went along, and the city grumbled. Theophanes says people wept in the streets for her, and then, as cities do, got on with things. Nikephoros visited the deposed empress with every courtesy, and swore oaths to keep her in comfort if she disclosed where the imperial treasure was lodged. And she, having no cards left, told him, and he broke every oath at leisure. She was exiled first to the convent she herself had founded on the island of Principo, and then, judged still too close to the capital, shipped out to Lesbos and confined under guard forbidden visitors. The woman who had signed herself Emperor of the Romans supported herself in her last months, the tradition says, by spinning wool. She died there in August 803, less than a year after her fall. Her body was brought back eventually to her island convent, and the church she had served remembered her kindly. Some Orthodox calendars carried her as a saint, blessed for restoring the icons, the same hands, the same woman, the porphyra notwithstanding. I'm going to leave it there, with the Saint's Day and the Purple Room. If you stuck with me through all 5 of these women, you're the reason this channel gets to make videos this long, and I appreciate you more than you know. Tell me in the comments which of the 5 is staying with you tonight, because I genuinely can't predict it. It's different every time. The next one is already half researched, and it's a strange one. Sleep well if you can.